Hello again, and welcome to the Cambridge PhDcasts. Today I'm speaking to Katie Hammond, who's a PhD student in the Department of Sociology. And Katie is working on egg donation and the controversies surrounding legislation and the experiences of egg donors in Canada. So Katie, if you'd like to give us a bit of an introduction to your research.
Yeah, for sure. So my topic is very specific, so I'm going to start on kind of a general level, if that's okay.
Perfect.
So very broadly, I look at infertility. So a lot of people actually don't know, but 15% of reproductive age couples face infertility in the world, according to the World Health Organization. So quite a few.
It's a big,
it's a very big number. Infertility is described as people who have been having unprotected sex for 12 months and are still not achieving conception. To break it down even further, I look at assisted reproductive technologies. So these are technologies that assist in achieving a conception, or they help to maintain a pregnancy. So they do both. And actually, these have become a huge market, which a lot of people also don't know. So in the US, I think it is a $3 billion industry right now of assisted reproductive technologies.
And that would incorporate things like IVF as well as...
Right, yeah. So IVF would actually be one of the most popular forms of these technologies that are used. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
But you work on an even more specific area of assisted reproductive technology.
So I look at egg donation. So when people do in vitro fertilization, sometimes they are unable to use their own eggs, so instead they'll use donor eggs. So that happens in, I think, about 12% of in vitro fertilization. So basically I look at donors, and I also look at the recipients of egg donation, and specifically I look at this in Canada.
Okay, fantastic. Now, before we get on to the situation in Canada itself, because it's something we're going to keep coming back to, can you give us an idea of what this actually involves for an egg donor and for someone who's the recipient of an egg donation? What are the treatments actually involved?
So it's actually a pretty big commitment. It's about 10 to 26 days. It kind of varies for an egg donor. So basically the first process is that we go through a lot of screening. So this would include like urine samples, blood samples, a whole bunch of things like this. And this is basically to test the condition of the person's eggs and their own fertility. So we look at the viability of eggs. If we determine that the genetics are okay and the viability of the eggs are okay, then the egg donor begins the process. So the idea is that they are stimulated with hormones. So we want to align the egg donor and the recipient's cycles together. Does that make sense? We use the hormones to try and yield more eggs than we normally would. So normally in one cycle, a woman would yield one egg only, right? But in egg donation, sometimes we will yield, I've heard cases of up to 30 or more eggs. Yeah, so a huge yield, because of course this increases the chance of having more successful eggs that the intended parent will be able to use. Okay,
and that's obviously, again, as I say, we'll come back to it, that's quite a significant commitment, as you said, for everyone involved.
Yeah.
So, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what the situation is in Canada today?
The way that it works in Canada is that egg donation is permitted. There are countries in the world where egg donation is not permitted. But there's very strict guidelines around it at the moment. So it's governed under what's called the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. This is an act that came in place in 2004. The objective of the act says that one of the purposes of this act is to protect the interests of people who might be vulnerable under the act. Within this, they include children who are born of assisted reproductive technologies, and they also include, for instance, women, because a lot of the fertility issues do affect women. Even though fertility issues often are male factor fertility issues, it does end up that a lot of the more invasive procedures are for women. What the act says is that in Canada, you cannot pay a donor. You can reimburse them for their expenses, but no payment is permitted. And actually, if you are caught paying a donor, theoretically, you could be charged very highly. So depending on whether you're charged by indictment or a summary conviction, you could get a charge of like $500,000 Canadian, or a sentence in jail of up to 10 years, or both. Okay. Yeah, so very big charge. Legal barrier. Yeah, very big charge.
Can I ask, before we get on to comparative stuff, can I ask what kind of, if there are elements of the law that are kind of, that haven't been actually put into practice or that don't seem to particularly work?
I talked to you about how egg donation, you cannot be paid for that. So that's under Section 7 of the Act. So it says that you cannot be paid, but you can be reimbursed for what they deem reasonable expenses. So reasonable expenses, that's a little bit broad, a little bit vague.
And is that not defined further?
It's not defined further.
Okay, right.
Yeah, so it was actually supposed to be defined further. So under Section 12 of the Act, they were actually going to make a comprehensive kind of list of what would be included. So that might include, for instance, childcare, if the donor has kids. That might include time off of work.
Which is significant, as we've seen already.
Of course, yeah, because it's, you know, you have to go to medical appointments for a lot of those days during that time period. And then, of course, the retrieval itself is quite time consuming and you have to recover from that. So that would have been included. Even just things like gas or parking expenses, all of the little things, basically any loss that you might have incurred during this time. But it hasn't been specified, so we don't know what has been included. And some people say that things like time off work or daycare expenses would not be included. So it's a little bit up in debate right now. Nobody's actually fully clear.
It makes it a real minefield.
Yeah.
So how does that compare? How does that legal situation that you've set out compare to places, to other jurisdictions?
I spend a lot of time looking at the United States and also the United Kingdom. The United States because they neighbor Canada, so they obviously have a lot of influence on Canada. And I also look at the United Kingdom because of our Commonwealth connection, and because actually the Canadian legislation was kind of trying to mimic what was going on in the United Kingdom. So a little bit we're following in their footsteps, a little bit. So in the United Kingdom, what goes on is, as of the last couple of years, actually, since I've been here, they've decided that for egg donation, you can be compensated a one-off compensation of £750. So that's it.
Okay, so and that's a flat fee.
Yeah, so instead of getting into all of this kind of craziness with trying to calculate the expenses and, you know, who's going to take all the receipts and see how much money people have spent, instead they say it's a flat fee of £750 and this is what the egg donor gets one time.
Okay.
The United States is kind of a totally different approach. So they have a free market approach.
Do you want to explain that?
Yeah. So it's kind of free, you know, you can do what you want. Basically, there are guidelines. The reproductive guidelines in the States say that it's not really ethical to give people money that's above $10,000.
Okay.
But it does go on. And you see this when you look online and you look at advertisements in the States, and you see that people are offering higher amounts than just $10,000.
Oh, wow. And is that because they're looking for very specific individuals?
Yeah, very specific individuals. So, for instance, I saw an ad recently, and they were looking for someone with a very specific GPA, a very specific SAT score, very specific height, very specific hair color, eye color, weight, all of these things. They wanted them to be, I think it was a swimmer, so very specific criteria, and they were offering $50,000.
So you've given us an idea of three very specific national situations. And obviously this is a very fraught issue, so could you introduce us a bit to what are the ethical considerations that result in regulation being applied or not in different countries?
So I'll just talk about two of the big ones that come up with compensation, because they're the ones that I really spend a lot of time looking at. So very broadly, the first one is there's a huge concern about the nature of the market. So what this includes is if donors are being paid, and also if this is an industry where clinicians are making a lot of money, then there's a concern that the clinicians kind of have another interest, right? Because they want to make money. They're not necessarily going to inform their donors the way that they might otherwise. They might, for instance, disguise the language of the procedure a little bit, make it sound not as invasive or not as much of a time commitment as it actually might be. So there's a worry there. It's a complete conflict of interest, right? Because when money becomes involved, then you don't know what people's actual motivations are.
Okay.
So the second thing is that there is a concern about coercion. So obviously if the money is a significant amount of money, then you worry that somebody is going to be coerced by the money. So they might be doing something that they would not otherwise do because they see the money as a good enough reason to do it. So this might stop them from actually considering the dangers for their physical health or for their psychological health, which are really big risks. Physically, there are risks of pain, there's risks of swelling, bleeding, ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which happens in about 1 to 10% of donors. And this involves swelling of the abdomen and also of the ovaries. So it's quite a dangerous side effect that can happen. Of course, psychologically, you are giving away a genetic aspect of yourself, right? So you will have a child out there that's 50% yours. There's a concern that a lot of people later in life might regret this or might think about this, or, you know, it's a lot of the similar kind of things that come up when people think about, for instance, adoption. So also under coercion, there's the idea that for women have an altruistic imperative. There's a history of women being long valued for their care. So if women feel this altruistic imperative, then they might do it just because they feel bound by social or cultural norms to do this when they actually don't want to. Or alternatively, they might feel pressure from, for instance, family or friends who feel that these women need to live up to these norms.
Which is presumably still a factor when you don't have it heavily marketized as it is in the US. There's still a factor of, you know, family members asking or friends asking. Makes it more difficult to say no.
Exactly. So in known donation, if your sister asks you or a friend asks you, then there's room for pressure in that situation as well.
As well as, I mean, the much wider concerns that people often express about genetic material in any form, this idea that is this something that can be traded, is this something that can...
Definitely.
Which is a really fascinating area too. So I suppose to get into just some more specifics, to get into the kind of the research that you're doing into this, what kind of data and what kind of sources are you working with to find out more about the situation in Canada?
So I work with 3 actually kind of main sources. So in order of importance, the first thing is I do a lot of interviewing. So that would be my prime area of data collection. So I speak with egg donors, obviously. I speak with intended parents, and I also speak with clinicians, or what I call fertility specialists. So this would include psychologists, counselors, lawyers, nurses, doctors, anybody who works in a specific context with donors. The next thing that I do is I work with advertisements. So there's a lot of people who post in online forums to try and connect. So donors and intended parents try and connect online through either these forums or through posting an advertisement online. So the third one, and this is a little bit lesser so, but I also look at different policy documents. So I obviously spend a lot of time kind of looking over the specific legislation, so the Assisted Reproduction Act. And I also look at cases that have come up. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a 2010 Supreme Court of Canada case that shut down a whole bunch of sections of the Act. So I look at that. And I also look at, for instance, there was what was called the Baird Commission. So this was a commission that looked at the perspectives of all of Canadians about infertility, and this took place in 1989. And what they wanted to do was garner the perspectives of Canadians and try and get a better understanding of how the legislation should come into place, what should it include, what are people concerned about, how do people feel about different things about assisted reproductive technologies. So those would be kind of the main policy documents.
So they're kind of 3 very different and very interesting sources, so we might work through them a bit now. I guess before we do, because I want to talk to you about the interviews themselves, I mean, is it fair to say before we do that you're working with avenues where this is occurring and compensation is being paid as well? So you're looking at not just at situations where the law is followed kind of in its exactly as written. You're looking at situations where people are kind of getting around it and offering compensation in certain ways.
Yes.
Okay, fair. Cool. So obviously that must make doing interviews and that kind of thing quite difficult. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the interviews that you're carrying out? Yeah,
it makes it really difficult because obviously donors who are donating and who are getting paid, this is not something they want to talk about because they are finding their way around the law. And intended parents who are paying donors obviously don't want to talk about their payment for donors either because again, they're kind of sneakily going around the law. So yeah, they're so tricky to track down. The donors especially would be the hardest group, I would say, to try and get to talk to, which is in part why I do talk with clinicians, because clinicians are able to give me a perspective that I might not be able to get otherwise because they see so many donors on a regular basis.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how you go about getting interviews like these? And presumably there are ethical issues in terms of anonymity that you have to follow as well.
Yeah, lots of ethical issues here because it is a very, very sensitive topic for a lot of people. And also when you bring in the legal aspects about that just kind of adds to the sensitive nature of the issue. Basically, the way that I go about doing it is that I will look on forums and I will look through Craigslist and Kijiji, which are kind of like our version of Gumtree. They're basically online classified advertisements. And so I go through looking for advertisements that have been posted by egg donors or have been posted by intended parents. And I contact people through those advertisements. Or I contact them through these online forums where they're having conversations or they've posted an advertisement there. Yeah, very, very sensitive topic. So before I speak to any donor or intended parent, first they get an information sheet that has a lot of details about the study, the purpose of the study, any possible implications. They have to sign a consent form. And actually, even after I speak with donors and I speak with intended parents, for donors, I actually give them a resource sheet that provides them with a bunch of resources about the issue and about how you could seek help if, for instance, this brought up any nerve-wracking or psychological kind of issues for them.
Okay, yeah, so it's a really intricate process getting this kind of testimony. And I think we'll turn in a second to asking kind of what you've learned from those interviews, but maybe before we do that, the second kind of source that you mentioned was looking at online classified ads. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about the process there and what people say and how it actually works? Yeah,
so I actually brought an example for you.
Excellent.
So this is kind of how I got into the area of compensation, because by looking through these ads online, I realized that people were asking for compensation or people were offering compensation, which of course, as I said earlier, is not allowed in Canada. So that's how I got really interested in the compensation aspect and about specifically the Canadian online market. So for instance, actually, I'm going to read you one of the very first advertisements that I found online. So this was posted in Toronto, Ontario on a classified advertising site. Someone wrote, "I am 19 years old, turning 20. I need money to get through my undergrad, and I find that this would be the best way. The reason I believe this to be the best way to get through something like this is because I believe that I can provide two people with the gift of a child. I also believe that if they are going to these great lengths to have a child, it shows how much they want a family. Please feel free to email me with any questions or concerns you may have."
Wow.
So this kind of highlights two aspects, right? Because it highlights the compensation aspect, but doubly it also talks about how they are doing it for an altruistic reason too, right?
I'm fascinated by these ads. And are there any that kind of go to the extremes of that American example that you mentioned? I mean, do people talk about physical attributes? Do people advertise particular things about themselves?
Yeah, that's actually very common in the ad. Actually, the ad that I just read you that didn't have that, that's uncommon.
Okay.
Yeah, so I actually brought with me one that has some physical attributes, if you'd like to hear it.
I would love to.
She writes, "Hello. Being very honest and forward, I'm hoping to receive compensation for donation to help offset my student debts." So again, the compensation aspect. "I'm an identical twin who is 26 years old, 5'8", with blonde hair and blue eyes. I am from the Ukraine and Lithuania. I have fair skin. I hold a Bachelor of Science and am most talented athletically and through visual arts."
Okay, wow.
So this one gets into the specifics. Some of them go as far as to say, "I'm this blood type. This is what my parents are like. These are the genetic diseases that run in my family." So it gets some of them are very, very specific.
And do you find that specificity in people who are looking for donors as well? Do they say we're particularly looking for someone with this background or these features? Or
Yeah, they do a little bit. I think I see less of that when I look at ads on the Canadian market, just because there is such a high demand on the Canadian market that I think people realize that they can't be that specific or they're not going to find anyone.
Okay.
But in terms of ethnicity and racial aspects, these are things that do pop up because, of course, you want someone who matches you in that way.
You've introduced us to some hugely interesting data, and I think what we're interested to see now, what I'm interested to see, is what it is that you've learned from this. So maybe some of the narratives that are coming out of this, but also what it tells us more widely about the situation surrounding egg donation in Canada.
Okay, so I'll start with the intended parent group. So I think one of the common kind of misconceptions about intended parents is not that they want to use egg donors, but I think because people see that intended parents are trying so hard to find an egg donor, that people forget that egg donation is really a last resort for intended parents. this is not where they wanted to be, right? They wanted to have their own kids genetically. And it's usually come down to either they've considered adoption. Almost all of the intended parents that I've spoken with have considered adoption. And it just, I mean, adoption isn't as simple as a lot of people think it is. So it's been a very complicated situation, and that's why they've now turned to egg donation. Or they've considered both simultaneously and kind of weighed the pros and cons and have decided on egg donation. So in that way, they're not exactly the group that a lot of people would think they are. Another kind of misconception about the intended parents is that a lot of them are quite old. So I think a lot of people get this view that if your own eggs don't work or aren't viable, then you must be, you know, in your 40s or really late 30s or something like that. But actually, that's not really the case. A lot of people that I speak to are maybe 35, maybe low 30s, and their eggs just aren't viable for a wide range of reasons. There's tons of reasons that could be the case.
So what about then the donor group themselves? I mean, are there particular misconceptions that you've disproven about those?
Yeah. One of the misconceptions, I guess, about donors is that all donors are from very low socioeconomic status. So for instance, students. A lot of people assume that donors would be students because they would see an offer of compensation and they would kind of jump at the chance of getting that.
When debt is a factor. And,
of course, yeah. To pay off, student debts or whatever. So a lot of people think that they would see this advertisement online or in a newspaper or in a magazine and just, you know, see $10,000 and just go for it. And that they wouldn't be very self-informed. They wouldn't have thought it through. But actually, that's not really the case. That's not what I'm finding anyway. I would say that probably a majority of the donors that I speak to are quite well informed. Some of them are from a lower socioeconomic status. Some of them are students, actually. But a lot of them are kind of like middle, like, I guess 30s. And many of them have had their own kids already. Many of them have spent a lot of time looking into this. They'll know someone who has gone through infertility, or some of them will say, I have a brother and he's gay and I want to do this because I would hope that someone would do this for my brother if he decided that he wanted to have kids. So some people will say, I specifically want to donate to a same-sex couple, for instance. And then other people just do it because they really value having kids and they've had that experience, and they just find it so sad to think that someone else might not get that experience if they really want it.
Okay. Which is just a hugely interesting contrast to kind of received ideas, I think.
Yeah.
Something I'd like to ask a bit about is... Obviously, with this data, it depends on people being willing to speak to you and willing to kind of come out, in spite of the fact that, as you say, they may have been acting around the law in some cases. So how do you worry to some extent that there are some silences, that you miss out on some experiences where people are reluctant to come forward? And if so, how do you deal with that in your work, with silences in the data, or particular voices that you might or might not be hearing?
Okay, certainly. I actually do suspect that there is quite a large group of donors who aren't speaking with me because they're very worried about the compensation aspect. So sometimes I will get emails from donors saying things like, I don't want to speak with you because I was compensated, but I'm emailing you to let you know that I was compensated. But I don't want to be involved for that reason. In addition to that, sometimes when I've been talking with fertility specialists, they'll tell me about, for instance, there was one example at one clinic where I think it was that a donor called the clinic and she very specifically made it clear on the phone that she was interested in donating, but only for compensation. And so somebody who was working at the clinic said to her, listen, we don't do compensation. That's not allowed. That's illegal in Canada. We can't do that. If you want to donate altruistically, great. And the donor was not interested as soon as she realized that she wouldn't make money from it. But then about a month later, the clinician said that a girl of the exact same name came in, and she was with a family that she had met over Kijiji. And as far as he knows, no money was passed between the intended parents and the donor. But he suspects that there is a possibility, since she was only keen on donating, she said, if she was compensated. But in that regard, he has no idea if she was paid or not. He can only go off what he suspects may have happened. So it goes completely unenforced.
So presumably you need to then, with your own research, kind of, you're aware that there might be these experiences that don't always appear in your own data set.
Oh, yeah. I totally suspected. And people actually, I mean, the majority of my donors say that they have been, you know, compensated by the books. But I do speak with donors quite frequently who say, oh yeah, they purchased a car for me, or they gave me a gift of paying my tuition. So it definitely is going on. I think that it's very possible that I'm seeing a slightly skewed perspective of that, though.
Okay. An issue that I think comes out of this, particularly given how close the US and Canada are, among other things, is a particularly hot topic at the moment, is reproductive tourism.
Yeah.
Is this something that you see any evidence of? Or that you think is a practice that is engaged in Canada?
Yeah, so this is a huge topic, actually, and this is coming up more and more in my research, especially when I speak with intended parents. So one thing that intended parents will say, I'll ask them, where did you go about trying to find a donor? And a lot of them won't have even considered looking in Canada. They will immediately say, oh, we went south of the border, we went to the United States. So this is a very common thing. I had one couple actually who I spoke with who said that they were just about to cross the border into the United States, and the wife said to her husband, oh my God, are we doing something illegal? I haven't thought this through. I don't know if we're allowed to do this. And she said she started panicking just as they were about to go over, because she thought, I actually don't know what the rules are about this. I don't know if we're allowed to do this. But her husband was like, just say what, you know, the clinicians said to say. Just say that we're crossing the border for a medical procedure, and that's it. And a lot of the Canadian clinics, it's a very well-known thing that they do kind of have a sister clinic that's in the United States. So if you do need treatments like surrogacy or egg donation or sperm donation even, you'll go across the border and you'll do that aspect of your treatment there. Or the donor will come to Canada for you.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is very widely known that this is going on. And a lot of people feel very frustrated because they're saying things like, why are we sending people abroad to the United States? Or, you know, we have Canadians going everywhere. We have Canadians going to India. Spain has become kind of a prime area, a whole bunch of places in Europe. And people, especially the clinicians, feel very frustrated because we're losing those resources. So on an economic level, it's not necessarily good. But more importantly, we don't know anything about the services that are taking place in other countries, right? So at least we can control these things if they're going on in Canada. But when people are going away, we have no idea how well taken care of the donors are, really importantly, and how well taken care of the intended parents are.
So ethical issues as well as kind of healthcare-based issues as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, broadly, this project, I mean, it's an amazing insight, or kind of a very intimate insight as well, into a market that's like no other, and something that so many people just simply don't know about or are unaware of. But, I mean, evidently the situation in Canada seems to be imperfect in some ways. I mean, can I ask the big question here, which is, I mean, do you see kind of wider policy implications for your work or for your own findings, or have you come out of this with a sense of what needs changing in Canada? Yeah,
that's a hard one to say. That's obviously what my end goal of my research would be, but finding an answer that would deal with all of this is, you know, basically impossible. I guess I would say that from doing this research, we have learned a couple of things. The first thing would be that we need to decide, as Canadians, we need to decide what we're going to do. Either we're going to say that yes, you can receive payment of some sort, or no, you cannot. I think it needs to be one or the other, and I think that we need to make that clear, because currently we have a situation that's not working because we're saying no, you cannot, but we're not enforcing that. So we need to specify that. We need to have regulation that says if you can be even just reimbursed, what those amounts would be, because we're not doing that. I rarely would say that we should follow kind of a social phenomenon and legislate based on that, but this is a market kind of like no other market we've seen before. The desire to have children is just it's a completely different thing. People are willing to go to such great lengths to have kids. I mean, as we've already discussed, they're crossing international borders. They're breaking laws that they're aware of by paying donors. People are remortgaging their houses. It's a market that just like no other, really. So I think in that regard, no matter what happens, even if we do say that no payment isn't allowed in Canada, we're still going to have donors who are going to be going abroad and they're going to be engaging in reproductive tourism. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to decide exactly what we want to do. And then from there, I think that we need to put in place policies to protect the interests of the intended parents and to protect the interests of the donors. Because having this kind of black market that's going on is not protecting anything, because nobody knows what's going on. You have no one to fall back to or to report to if something bad happens, because essentially you're doing something you're not supposed to. Mm-hmm. In addition, I think we're really missing regulation in terms of how many times can a donor donate, because that's not being very well monitored. Mm-hmm. And obviously it's a risky procedure. It becomes more risky the more times that you engage in it. So if a donor donates a couple times at a clinic and moves on to another clinic, we have no idea how many times they've actually put themselves through this process. Yeah. Also, because there's so few donors, the hormone doses are being increased slightly, it would appear. So this means that we're yielding a greater number of eggs from our donors, but this also puts our donors in greater risk in terms of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So these are kind of risky things that we should be monitoring. Also, we should maybe consider having better ways to inform our donors and inform our intended parents about the legislation and about the medical process, because we're not doing that.
So it seems that this original legislation, which might have had a noble idea at the heart of it, we're not sure, but it has certainly, by not providing regulation and by not kind of overseeing, procedures, has really left a lot of people in limbo, essentially.
Yeah,
part of this.
It has, yeah.
I suppose as a final question, what do you think is the future of the legislation in Canada? Is it a case of reforming the Act as it stands, or is it going to be scrapping that and building something new from scratch?
So I would say that the chance of anything happening to the current Act is very unlikely because of this Supreme Court of Canada decision that basically said it's unconstitutional as it stands because healthcare in Canada is generally a provincially regulated thing, but of course this is a federal document that's trying to regulate healthcare, so a whole bunch of sections got taken out of the Act. So I think the likelihood of anything changing or anything being added is not going to happen. If something were to happen, regulation-wise or other, because it doesn't need to be done through law, right? There's other ways to promote these changes, through regulatory guidelines and things like that. That's how we can bring about counselors being more informed or doctors better informing patients. So it's going to be up to probably the provinces and probably the territories to take some kind of initiative to put in place regulation of their own. This has been done a little bit, but the incentive to take initiative to do this is not very high because a lot of people don't see infertility as something that's very high on the priority list because, like I said earlier, a lot of people don't know about it unless they've experienced it firsthand or they know somebody who has, right? So I think the likelihood of something happening that way is very unlikely. I think that Health Canada, which is a government body, has the potential to keep running workshops that they've been doing to try and get better input from what Canadians want and how Canadians feel about infertility and about egg donation and about assisted reproduction generally. And I think that we would have to go from there. But I think a really good starting point would be regulatory guidelines of some kind that would say that donors need to be informed in a certain way, counselors need to deal with specific things with them, we need to have some kind of database, which was an original intent of the Act that got struck down, that we keep track of donors and how often they're donating. So little things like that I think would need to come into play, and ideally I would love to see the provinces and territories taking more initiative to get something going here.
But it might be a process of gradual change before the market you've sketched for us really starts to change. Yeah,
I think the first step is helping people become more informed about this, because this is not an issue that's going to go away. The number of people who are using egg donors is increasing, and I think it's going to continue to do so, and the number of people who will continue to use assisted reproductive technologies, particularly because people are waiting longer and longer to have kids, is going to continue to rise. So yeah, a first step is just kind of informing people and getting people to realize that this is a really important topic that we need to be thinking about, and we need to be protecting the interests and balancing the interests of both egg donors and intended parents.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you for informing us so well and informing everyone who watches PhDcasts, because it's a wonderful topic and something we need to know a lot more about. out. So thank you so much, Katie.
Perfect. Thanks, John.
Thanks for listening to this Cambridge PhDcast, presented by me, John Gallagher, and produced by Richard Blakemore and Ruth Rushworth, and produced in association with CRASSH. If you'd like to hear more from us and for our fantastic collection of PhDcasters, please visit the CRASSH website at CRASSH, that's with 2 S's, .cam.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.